And here's Corina's slides. There we go. Okay. Welcome, everyone. So this Experts at Work session is exploring how can HR better look after itself. This session is for members of all three of our networks, as you know, and we're only recording the speaker part of this session to allow for a franker conversation. I'll ask you just to pop yourself on mute. Is that might be me, actually. Apologies. Is that better? Okay, sorry, problems with the sound there. I do apologise. Welcome to Corina Forman. Corina is HR Director, APC, and as a practising HR Director there, Corina Forman is well placed to know how well HR practitioners look after themselves or don't. So that's the subject of conversation today. And as part of her MSc in Organisational and Business Psychology, Corina has undertaken research into stress in the HR profession, which uncovered, which won't surprise anyone on this call, some key issues in how the HR function manages its own well-being. Network members comment often that the HR function can have the lowest engagement scores in the organisation, not least as a result of working hard to look after everyone else. So we're going to have lots of input from Corina, for which we're very grateful. First of all, and then we're going to go into a breakout to explore your experiences of HR looking after itself or not for around about 50 minutes, something like that. And obviously the recording will go off at that point. We'll have 10 minutes recommendations from Corina, and then feedback and discussion in the round, and that bit will be under the Chatham House rule again as well, with a half finish at 12 o'clock. Do send us questions and suggestions via chat throughout. Very interested in your views, as always. Please put yourselves on mute for now if you haven't already. Thanks ever so much. Corina, thanks again, and over to you.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you for the lovely introduction, and good morning, everybody. So if we just go to the background slide, Richard, the next slide, fabulous. So a bit of the background, first of all, to this study. I think it's notable that in 2020, the Health and Safety Executive reported that stress is now the leading cause of sickness absence from work. And interestingly, professionals report highest rates of stress than any other occupational group. And high rates of stress are obviously known to have an adverse financial impact on organisations. In HR, we all know about the pressure to manage absence rates and things like that. But research is still unravelling the long-term health implications for individuals. So in 2017, the results of a 30-year-long CADE study provided compelling evidence that stress in midlife is a significant risk factor for development of dementia and cognitive decline in later life. The headlines on this slide are from different articles about stress in the HR profession. But if you do a quick Google search, you'll find many, many more articles all on the same theme. In 2017 and 2019, HR Magazine reported on HR professionals' loss of sleep and the cost of HR stress to organisations. In 2019, the Law Gazette reported that lawyers are the second most stressed profession. HR professionals took the top spot. So a wide range of factors have been shown to contribute to stress, and often it's thought to be the interaction of environmental variables in the workplace and the individual, which is thought to cause specifically work-related stress. However, if one occupational group is reporting disproportionate rates of stress, then this suggests that there may be specific stressors that are inherent to the role or the work. And really, this is what I set out to explore in the study that I did. Just moving on again. Before I continue, I do feel that a little disclaimer of sorts is warranted. My research did uncover some interesting role stressors, but the most recurrent theme that emerged from the study was the participants' desire to contribute positively to their organisations and the people they employ. The participants in this study were all incredibly passionate about HR. And I have to say that overall, there was very little complaining about the HR role, but quite a lot of humour and laughter as the participants navigated some of the paradoxes in their work. And I thought I'd include this quote because I think it sort of sums that up quite nicely. So just moving on to just give a bit of an overview of the literature review that I conducted. Obviously, before starting my own study, I wanted to do a literature review both on stress and also the HR profession. And really two kind of key things stuck out for me when I did this literature review. The first is that there's very little research on stress in the HR profession, notwithstanding that if you do a Google search, you'll find quite a lot of articles on it. There's very little academic research. And secondly, the second thing that became apparent to me is actually that the work of HR professionals is not terribly well understood by academics. And in fairness, a lot of the articles written by academics concede that the work of HR professionals is not well understood. With respect to stress in the HR profession, there is a small cluster of studies which focus on the impact of toxin handling. And toxin handling is broadly defined as any work that involves managing the negative emotions of others. Another small group of studies have examined emotional labour, which is broadly the kind of need to regulate your own emotions in order to meet role requirements. And it's an interesting topic because it's been found to be a significant role stressor in service sector type roles. However, I think it has to be said that the HR studies, both with respect to toxin handling and emotional labour, were fairly inconclusive. So some of the participants in those studies actually reported that toxin handling, emotional labour gave them a sense of accomplishment when they did it well, whereas others did report that, it was a stressor for them. Just moving on, we can see that there's one study which has examined HR professionals' experience of stress due to new technologies. I think we've just jumped to a slide, doesn't matter. Within HR. So obviously a lot of us are seeing that there's a lot of new technology coming into HR. There's been the advent of, data analytics. We've got a lot about artificial intelligence now. So there has been a study on the impact of that. And a couple of other studies have looked at HR's role in redundancy, bullying and harassment procedures. But I have to say they haven't specifically investigated stress in managing those processes, but they've more kind of looked at where the split between the HR roles and line manager roles falls in dealing with those processes. Just moving on to the next slide then. In contrast to the psychology literature, there is an absolute abundance of HR commentary and research literature focusing on topics such as HR role tensions and conflict, the HR professional's identity. So there's quite a lot about HR's legitimacy, credibility. I've got a bit of feedback there. And also, I think it's fair to say there's quite a lot of negative stereotypes about HR professionals within some of that HR literature and commentary. And the other area that's widely covered is role ambiguity, specifically, I think, with respect to this split between where the line between HR work and line managers' work begins and ends. I think it's fair to say that very little of this research engages with the perceptions and experiences of HR professionals. There's a lot of commentary about it, but not that many studies which actually engage with the views of the professionals working in the field. What I find interesting about these topics is that role tensions and conflict, professional identity threats, and role ambiguity have all been shown to predict work-related stress in other occupational groups. But to date, there's been no research examining the impact of these types of issues on HR professionals. So just moving on to the next slide, before I run through the findings of the summary, just for transparency, I think it's important to give you a bit of an overview of the study parameters. The aim of the study was to explore causes of role stress. And so I make no inferences here about the prevalence or rates of stress in the profession. For this reason, I did a qualitative study and I used a semi-structured interview format. I didn't interview anybody that I knew, but I ran an advertisement through various professional groups on LinkedIn and included inclusion criteria. So the inclusion criteria sought for participants that were senior role holders, so that was HR manager, business partner up to HRDs, professionally qualified, with at least 5 years experience, practicing in the UK and with no reported mental health problems. These exclusion criteria really aimed to try and control for factors such as national context, experience, training, and pre-existing mental health problems, which can all mediate stress. 11 participants agreed to be interviewed from a range of sectors and organisations. And the interview questions really kind of probed the causes of work-related stress, their reactions to stress, and any strategies for mitigating the adverse impact of stress. The interviews were transcribed and analysed for both diverging and converging themes. And then these themes were related back to psychological theory and research. And methodology and analysis were all sense-checked by my dissertation supervisor, Dr. Penny Cortriand, just to make sure I wasn't coming up with any spurious findings. So let's have a look at the findings. In this first cluster, you can see that there are 5 themes and their prevalence is in brackets. So you can see control was cited by 10 of the participants, conflict by 11, ambiguity cited by 11 participants. And I categorized all of these under the heading of the HR role. I think these themes are really interesting because they situate HR role stress really within the broader environmental context. So it's widely acknowledged that the contemporary organisational environment is one of ever increasing complexity and change. And I think it's worth noting that this study was conducted during the pandemic, the first year of the pandemic. And I think for anybody working in HR, we saw an awful lot of that complexity and very rapid, unprecedented change during the year of that pandemic. I think what's notable also is that there's a growing recognition that this type of environment where there's rapid change really defies control, and that this lack of control can contribute to cognitive overload and increased stress. Within psychology research, control is very much associated with agency and self-efficacy, both of which support positive mental health. Conversely, feeling out of control can have an adverse impact on mental health. So I think this is highly relevant for HR and other professions and really raises the question of what we can do to ensure that people still feel empowered in environments that are rapidly changing and complex and which arguably do defy control. How do you retain that sense of empowerment in those very fast changing environments? The themes of role conflict and role ambiguity, I think, also warrant some attention. Sorry, it's back on the next thing. That's it. Fantastic. The HR literature always assumes that organisations want more strategy from their HR professionals. But what this study identified is that different stakeholders have very diverse expectations. And actually, some stakeholders don't want much strategy at all. The ensuing tug of war over roles, responsibilities and priorities contributes to role conflict and ambiguity. And again, both of these have been linked to stress and also depression in other occupational groups. So, some of the participants reported trying to be very strategic and really trying to lead on that strategic agenda with, line managers and stakeholders in the organisation that actually wanted them to kind of do the admin and, be the kind of shoulder to cry on when things were kind of going wrong in the department. And that sometimes those expectations of other stakeholders would actually frustrate the participants' ability to be as strategic as they wanted to be. And then finally, probably not much of a surprise to anyone here, resource constraints were also perceived as contributing to stress by frustrating the ability to satisfy diverging stakeholder expectations and role objectives. Moving on to the next slide, the next group of themes are clustered under the general heading of the HR identity. I think I mentioned earlier that negative HR stereotypes are prevalent in the HR literature. And in psychology research, it's widely accepted that negative stereotypes are both enduring and resilient, but also exert a pervasive and unconscious influence on attitudes, behaviour, identity, and mental well-being. In this study, the influence of negative stereotypes was both overt and covert. So a few participants perceived that HR is viewed negatively by the wider social context, as well as people in their organisation. So I think one of the participants specifically said that, you know, when she talks to people and she tells them she works in HR, the reaction was, "Ugh, HR." For other participants, the presence of negative stereotypes is more kind of covert and was revealed through these distancing tactics, such as the one typified in this quote. So we can see here that the tea and tissues metaphor is used to describe the type of HR, which none of us want to be. But in this example, it's really used to differentiate and distance the participant from a negative HR stereotype. So what in effect is happening here is the participant is acknowledging that there's this negative stereotype of the tea and tissues type of HR, but that's kind of definitely not me. And so that's a way of kind of preserving self-esteem and self-identity in the face of these negative stereotypes. I think it's really interesting to sort of think about where these HR negative stereotypes might come from. And there's a field of research which I found really fascinating, and it's all about role stigma and dirty work. And it really focuses on the experience of people in occupations that are considered morally, physically, or socially tainted by others in society. And the research suggests that people working in those tainted occupations are firstly very well aware of the stigma, but also experience role stress as a direct result of that stigma. And interestingly, the research also shows that people working in those tainted occupations develop specific strategies for protecting their self-esteem and identity, and for buffering the stress. So within professional occupations, this can include the use of linguistic devices, such as the distancing tactic that we've seen on this quote here, but also with the use of euphemisms, which effectively veil aspects of the work that we think others might find morally questionable. So, for example, nearly all of the participants spoke of restructuring rather than redundancy. It's a way of kind of softening what the real meaning of that work involves. Moving on then to the last slide on findings, I'm sure it comes as no surprise, but workload did emerge as a role stressor in this study. But it's not just about the volume of work. Obviously, lots of professions might suffer from high volumes of work. It was more about the unpredictable, fast-paced, ever-changing, and sometimes ambiguously defined nature of HR work. The toll of toxin handling also emerged clearly in this study and is typified by the first quote on this slide. In fact, several participants described absorbing the negative emotions of others. And, you know, it's really tempting to think of this as entirely kind of perceptive, but there is recent neuroscientific research which suggests there could be a biological basis. So the human mirror neuron system plays a key role in empathy because it allows us to simulate the feelings of others. But constant exposure then to negative interactions can then adversely impact mental and physical health. Obviously, in social and mental health care settings, workers have training and one-to-one supervision to help them maintain the delineation of themselves from others, but also to impede the transfer of negative emotions. But this doesn't typically form part of the HR qualification or indeed the support route for HR professionals. And I think it's interesting that as HR professionals, we're often prized for our empathy, but actually this very empathy could be kind of a bit of an Achilles heel and be one of the factors that does contribute to particular role stress in the profession. Relatedly, employment relations work also emerged as a specific role stressor in this study, not just because it invariably involves aspects of emotional labour and dealing with others' toxic negative emotions, but also, and I think importantly, because of the perceived risk of litigation. And again, this is not a factor that is generally considered in relation to HR work. Well, I certainly never read a research paper on HR that suggested this was an issue for HR professions. And I think it's often assumed that HR professionals always instruct lawyers when things get a bit tricky. But the findings of the study suggest that many HR professionals feel an expectation to manage complex and sometimes highly litigious ER matters internally. Some participants felt that their legitimacy and their credibility were reinforced by being the kind of internal employment law expert. And for others, there was simply a pressure to avoid the costs associated with taking external legal advice. And again, I think this is interesting because risk of litigation is a very well documented role stressor in other occupations, but hasn't been studied in relation to HR work. And finally, this one really surprised me. I wasn't expecting particularly to find this, but remuneration emerged as a specific HR practice which can contribute to role stress. And the issues here really focus very much on fairness, transparency, and the subjective nature of some organisations' remuneration practices. And I think as HR professionals, we are privy to the inner workings of the organisations that employ us. So where there is unethical practice or injustice, then the psychological contract of their HR professional is jeopardised. And I think the sense of security and organisational belonging can also be undermined. And this then puts the HR professional at greater risk of experiencing role-related stress. So that kind of concludes really the main headlines on the findings of the study. And I think we're kind of moving to a breakout session, just a couple of questions for you to just kind of focus on or chat about. And the first was really, which of these findings resonate for you? And why do you think HR reports high levels of stress?
Bear with me a sec. We just pause the recording.
This meeting is being recorded.
Bit of an echo, apologies. Right, Corina, let's get your slides back up. Apologies. Is that the right one?
That's it. Perfect. So just moving on to the recommendations then. Before we go into the detail on that, one of the things that I found very interesting when I did the study was that none of the participants had seen specific initiatives implemented to support HR professionals with work-related stress. And I think concerningly, as this quote highlights, implicit role expectations can impede HR professionals' proclivity to access support, even where this does exist for others in the organisation. HR professionals in this study perceived that they were the face or the voice of the organisation, and that reaching out for support could undermine that kind of corporate ambassador role. For those in leadership positions, there were also fears that other organisational leaders might perceive them as being unable to cope, and that this might challenge the hard-won credibility and legitimacy of the HR function. So from that, let's have a look at what practices for supporting stress did emerge from the study. Just move on to the next slide. Something that did emerge is those participants that were working in organisations with a very people-centric, ethical, well-being focused culture perceived that this culture enabled them to thrive and better cope with role stress. And this kind of makes perfect sense when we consider that implicit role expectations can make it difficult for HR professionals to engage with isolated interventions. And it really kind of suggests that actually investing in the culture of the organisation and trying to shape the culture of the organisation towards that kind of far more ethical, well-being, people-centric type culture is probably going to reap better benefits than bringing in a counsellor once a week who's, maybe there for anybody to kind of sign up to. Just moving on to the next sort of recommendation. several participants perceived that strategic HR and the business partner model can also buffer stress. And that's primarily because it enables practitioners to develop stronger commercial ties and credibility within the organisation. It also enables professionals to perhaps specialise according to their own strengths, whilst also improving the clarity of roles and responsibilities. One of the things that many of the participants talked about was the incredible wide breadth of skills and attributes that HR practitioners now need. So on the one hand, there has to be, this incredible empathy, this ability to deal with people, but we also have to be communications experts. We need to be data analysts. We need to be tech wizards. So there's this tremendous breadth of skills now that, certainly somebody working in a HR generalist role kind of has to master to be effective in all aspects of the role. And so the feeling was that the business partner model, which tends to kind of have that focus on specialisms, kind of allows people to specialise where their own personal strengths are, but also helps to define, those sort of role parameters and boundaries a little bit better. The third one in here, which we actually talked about a little bit in our group chat, was the importance of line manager support. And that emerged as just absolutely key to resilience in the role. So for HR leaders, this means having a good with your own line manager. And I think that's the ability to kind of have an open conversation when perhaps, things need to change or need to be done differently in the organisation to improve well-being. But it's also for HR practitioners that are line managers, it's also about being an accessible and supportive line manager to the HR team. One participant particularly, as we kind of went through the interview, recognised that their own kind of grin and bear it attitude to role stress. I think she used the term that, I kind of think I'm paid for this. It's part of the course. I have to just get on with it. But she kind of recognised that perhaps that wasn't a healthy role modelling for members in her team, and perhaps a much more open dialogue about role stressors and more openness to that is perhaps better role modelling for the team. Peer support by way of regular team meetings and also opportunities to collaborate can be really important for resilience as well. Now, this has real implications for the many HR practitioners that are working in standalone roles. And so forums like this one, it's a little punt there for you, Richard, are absolutely great, as are other online groups. And I kind of think that almost anybody working in a standalone role ought to have access to other support forums with other HR professionals. We then came to a few specific initiatives that participants felt would be useful for particular HR professionals if they were struggling with work-related stress, or if they were at risk of work-related stress, perhaps by virtue of the particular work that they were carrying out. And these were resilience training, one-to-one supervision, which is widely used in the sort of social care, mental health context settings. And again, somebody in our breakout group talked about the fact that counsellors have counselling to help them cope with all that emotional baggage that they're taking on, and to help separate themselves from the people that they counsel. And the aim of one-to-one supervision is broadly the same, to sort of provide that sort of soundboard for somebody to talk about what they're experiencing in their work, and to actually ensure that, or to try and encourage boundaries to be maintained, that delineation of the self from others, and coaching as well. I think what's interesting about resilience training, one-to-one supervision, coaching, is to a great extent there's empirical evidence that these types of initiatives can be effective. And finally, risk assessments. I think it's really interesting that we would automatically recommend a risk assessment before sending someone with a respiratory illness, for example, to work in a dusty environment. But most of us probably wouldn't think to conduct a risk assessment before assigning a colleague to conduct a redundancy process. and perhaps we should. If a colleague has been struggling with depression, anxiety, or stress, or is perhaps recently bereaved or divorced, then I think there are certain aspects of ER work that can be highly stressful, and we perhaps ought to be thinking about putting measures in place to mitigate the risk of mental harm to that colleague. So in summary, I think the study did identify a complex range of role stresses, but for me, the significant finding was that implicit role expectations actually can make it harder for HR professionals to access support. An ethical, well-being focused culture, a strategic HR, the business partner model, line manager, peer support, one-to-one supervision, resilience training, coaching and risk assessments may all play a role in helping to buffer role stress. That kind of brings us to the end of the recommendations. If there's time, I'm really happy to take any questions. I'm very happy for anybody, if you want to email me directly with any questions following the session, then Richard, I'm really happy for you to share my contact details.
Thank you ever so much, Corina. That's brilliant, and it gives us lots of food for thought. So what I'm going to do is just stop the recording.